much coffee should I put in my roaster? Part 2. I wrote an article for Roast Magazine about coffee roasting batch size, and through all the interviews I did, there was way too much information to put it all in the written article. So I'm publishing the full interviews here on YouTube so you can learn everything I learned. If you missed that first video with Shelby Williamson, I'll put the link in the description below. In this video, I talk with Scott Rao of Prodigal Coffee and, well, just the coffee industry in general. Scott has a long history of educating, writing, and consulting with coffee professionals around the world. In this interview, Scott shares some key batch size insights, including a formula for calculating the maximum batch size of your machine, tips for between batch protocol, differences between traditional drum roasters and air roasters, and a lot more. Let's get to it. Here's my interview with Scott. Thank you, Scott, for joining me. You've written about batch sizes on your blog, in your books, and on Instagram, and you talk about it in your master classes. So I figured you were the perfect person to ask about batch sizes. So first of all, why is batch size important for a roaster to consider?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Nice to chat with you in person finally. In most machines, I think batch size is important to consider because a lot of machines may not be as powerful as their capacity would imply. So you might have a 12-kilo machine with a relatively underpowered burner, and maybe you really shouldn't put 12 kilos in it. Maybe you should be putting 6 or 7 or 8 or something like that, especially a lot of older drum roasters. I've seen some that were not really even powerful enough to do a half batch in 15 minutes, that kind of thing. So I think it's important people to be aware of that. I think at very small batch sizes, you can sometimes produce amazing coffee, but if the batch size is extremely small, let's say you're putting 2 kilos in a 12-kilo machine, you might not get any relevant bean temperature data because the bean probe won't be in the beans, right? So I think those are the two big considerations, but then I'm sure we could talk about exceptions and special situations and all that kind of stuff.
As with roasting, there are always exceptions.
it's like a long list.
Yeah,
exactly.
You mentioned not a machine not having enough power to adequately get through a batch. And I know in your book, The Coffee Roasting Best Practices, you published a guideline using the burner output to determine max batch capacity.
Sure.
Like practically, how can a roaster find that info? Is that does it come with the roaster maintenance brochure? Do they have to calculate it somehow?
Sure. Obviously depends on the machine. Most machines have a little badge somewhere on the side or the back that says electrical and gas requirements. And usually it says something like BTU per hour or kilojoules per hour. Sometimes it's in the manual, sometimes it's in the marketing PDF, and sometimes at the extreme, you might have to find out the model number of the burner and then look it up online or call the manufacturer, but that's extremely rare. I want to say that the big exception to this is like you use a Loring, I use an IMF. Both machines recirculate hot air. So because they're conserving a lot more heat, obviously, whatever formula you might apply to a once through drum roaster may not apply to our machines because they don't need as much power every minute because they're not losing as much heat out the chimney at any given time.
You have a rule then for IMF and Lorings?
Not really, because I think all the IMFs, I've used several different sizes. All of them can pretty much do a full batch in about 8 minutes. And I know the Lorings vary a little bit based on the size of the machine, but I think all the Lorings are capable of doing a full batch, but in slightly different amounts of time, depending on which model you have.
Cool. And how would a roaster go about experimenting with that? Do you suggest just like loading it to max capacity, turning the burner all the way up and seeing how long it takes?
I mean, you totally can. I think you would just to see, but I think the simple formula, if you have a drum roaster, a once through one pass, if you will, drum roaster is in US units, it's roughly speaking 5,000 BTUs per hour of burner capacity gives you the capacity to roast about a pound of green per batch. It's a very fuzzy calculation because I'm making an assumption of, let's say, like a 12-minute roast. Obviously, if you say I don't mind roasting in 30 minutes, you could go with a much lower power output per pound. And in metric, that's about, I think, 11,600 kilojoules per hour per kilogram of green. So those are the equivalents, and that's usually easy information to find for most machines. So, and it's pretty straightforward. I I kept very subjective notes over the years of different machines I use and what I felt like were their reasonable. When I say reasonable, like, you can roast in say 12 minutes without being on 100% burner, like more than half the roast or something like that. And then I found a paper. I don't remember who wrote it, but it was from some Italian scientists where they took a very small lab roaster, they put it in a little controlled box, like a tiny room in a sense, and they measured the heat generated by the burner. They measured the heat that effectively got absorbed by the beans, and they measured the heat that went up the chimney. They did some calculations, and what their calculations said was very close to the 5,000 BTUs per hour per pound of green. So that was validating, and it kind of jived with real life experience.
Cool. And how would a roaster know if they use that calculation to guide them like at the start? How would they know if that doesn't work, if they can put more beans in, or if they should scale down?
Right. So I think of that calculation as telling you the largest batch size you should consider, but not necessarily the optimal batch size. So then we get in again. I'm not going to think about recirculation roasters, and generally I'm not going to think about air roasters here because they're all quite different. But there are some machines with a very thin single wall drum that might be prone to hot spots. And machines like that, you might not want to push the boundaries of the equation and say, like, oh, the equation says I could do 10 kilos. That might be okay, but the amount of flame you need to roast 10 kilos might be so much that that thin single wall drum might get too hot. And so just like when you're cooking, I know it seems silly, but like if you're cooking pancakes or eggs, there's kind of a known temperature limit. You don't want the pan surface to go beyond that, or else the pancake or egg starts to burn or dry out or something like that, right? So I think the same thing applies to drum roasters. Whatever that temperature limit is, you kind of want to stay away from it. And I think in some machines, if it's extreme, you would see excessive tipping, some scorching on the bellies of beans, that kind of thing. In other machines, you may not see evidence of it, but you might taste a little bit more harshness from conduction if the drum surface gets too hot.
Yeah, that was my next question is how do an overfilled or underfilled, probably more overfilled, how do the, I don't know, results of that end up in the cup
Sure.
on the cupping table?
Sure. And it's actually really, I've been thinking about this even before you contacted me about this. I was thinking about it a lot the last couple of weeks because I found some machines, if you fill it up to about the reasonable amount that you should based on the burner capacity and the drum size, that they perform really well. And there's other machines when you put very little coffee in, you actually sometimes get a little bit more conduction, because I think it really depends on the drum thickness and material and how what size of flame is going to affect it. And just like the pancakes and the eggs, if you have a lot of food in the pan, a given flame under the pan is not going to make the pan as hot as say when the pan is empty, right? So then you get into tricky things like, well, what's your between batch protocol, and what starting temperature of drum surface do you have? But all that complicated stuff aside, I think if you have a drum roaster and you stay below the 1 pound per 5,000 BTUs, and you make reasonably good choices as a roaster, you're not say trying to roast too hot and too fast, things like that. Like I think you're in the sweet spot as far as not having to worry about too much conduction, hopefully.
Yeah. And are there other machine parameters like RPM or airflow that would affect the amount of coffee that you put in a roaster?
In an air roaster, yes, in the sense that like if you have so like I have let's say, and you have like I think of the burners in the IMF and the Loring as sort of like a heat storage device, right? Like it's this tremendous source of heat when you want it. And in that sense, more airflow is just going to get you faster roasting. In an ambient burner uh, drum roaster, increasing airflow is actually going to make the flame a little bit cooler. So there's sort of a trade-off. So you don't really get much faster or slower when you increase the airflow. You kind of are just running air through faster, which gives you more heat transfer, but you end up with a cooler flame, which gives you less heat transfer, and they almost cancel each other out. Um, so I think, again, like if people are kind of sticking in the relatively safe zone, if their RPMs are correct for their drum diameter, and they're not using excessive airflow, then I think they're pretty safe. The excessive airflow comment applies to the idea that And I learned this the hard way, for sure, but and confirmed it for myself recently because I had a friend had a 500-gram drum roaster, and I really never liked the coffee coming out of it. It was always either underdeveloped or slightly roasty. And finally, I was like, let me play with it for a few hours because I'm not really sure what the problem was. But I realized that the airflow was set way too high, and it's really hard to tell, right? It's easy to tell when airflow is too low because you get a lot of smoke and chaff coming out, right? It's kind of hard to tell when airflow is too high by just looking at the machine or the beans, right? And what happened was we decreased the airflow tremendously, so much so that we were able to use much lower gas settings, and his weight loss numbers at the same outer bean color ended up going up a lot. And what I believe that meant was that we decreased conduction a lot by lowering the airflow enough to be able to use a smaller flame and then keeping the drum surface a little bit cooler. So it's a little paradoxical because I think most people, if you say, how do you increase convection, they would say increase airflow, which is true if all else was being equal. But because the flame gets cooler, it's not all else being equal. So the having the appropriate relatively low airflow level in the drum roaster seems to optimize the convection conduction ratio.
So even with a lower burner, you have more energy circulating within.
Yeah, you're not losing the energy as fast, right? So I mean, something I discovered recently, because I've always wondered, I think a lot of us feel like the old version of the UGI Probots were kind of sweet for drum roasters. And the more modern Probots are kind of hit and miss. And I think most people feel, and maybe it was just that there was a time in our careers where we were like, oh, our first great coffee came from one of those machines. But I realized that the old UGI Probots didn't have adjustable fans, and their default airflow setting in that espresso damper setting was actually very low. In fact, so low that in Probat P series and the new versions of the UG machines they make, you actually aren't allowed to set the airflow that low. So the new machines, the minimum airflow is much higher than the old machines had it. And I think that might be the secret why the old machines were a little bit softer and prettier in flavor.
Interesting. That's fun. Something fun to play with.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be another article, airflow.
Right. Totally.
The history of airflow.
I'm sure Probat will love hearing about that.
Yeah. Well, so you do a lot of consulting, and you were just talking about your friend's 500-gram machine. So what are the main factors when you're working with a new client in determining the ideal batch size? You also referenced, calculating the max batch size, but how do you find what's ideal for that machine?
Sure. I'm sure you've had the experience too, where there's, and I'm not talking about your company, but like roaster companies in general, there's some owner somewhere who's like, put all the beans you can in the machine and don't take time between batches, right? And I've had a lot of those clients, and those, so the answer kind of differs a little bit depending on who you're dealing with. But I think if you stay a little bit below that 5,000 BTUs, per pound level, and if you are getting good bean temperature data, you're in pretty good shape. I mean, I tell most people, try to stay above 20% of the stated capacity, because usually below 20%, if the probe is in a good spot, you won't get good bean temperature data below 20%. And then in most machines, the formula tells you can go up to about 65 to 80% of stated capacity. That's average for most drum roasters for that formula. So I think that gives people a pretty wide range of batch sizes to work with in a drum roaster. In a Loring, IMF, Civets, machines like that, I don't have any concerns about people putting too much coffee in those machines, because to put it like oversimplified way, like hot air can't hurt coffee. Like I've charged air roasters at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and there were no burn marks. I did it just to find out, would there be burn marks in it, or like burnt flavor, and there wasn't. And so I guess, reasonably speaking, we're not going to damage the bean with hot air. So I think really we're only worried about drum roasters and not letting the drum surface get too hot. And other than that, you're pretty safe.
Cool. And we've mostly been talking about the roasters themselves, but are there any characteristics of beans that like change, whether it's processing method, country of origin, density, humidity, whatever, or moisture, that you'll take into consideration to adjust the batch size?
That's a great question. And I should say that in a way, I'm oversimplifying a bit, because there are some rare beans, like let's say Indian monsoon beans or something. density is not usually a big concern for me, but beans like that are so low density that if you put, say, 10 kilos in a 12 kilo machine, they actually take up, I don't know, maybe 20% more space than your average, say, high grown washed Colombian.
So just explode out the roaster.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I have back in the 90s when I was playing with these kind of things, I did have beans like that. I was like, oh no, they're not, they're actually falling out of the drum because they're so, low density, right? So I guess there's that funny extreme. And I think that the like you and I and most of our friends don't really roast many beans that I would call very soft. But my experience with extremely soft beans, like beans grown at a less than 1,000 feet, 1,000 meters altitude, and maybe processed probably natural, or God forbid like a monsoon, which is like really soft. Those you have to pull out, I think, every tool in your toolbox to prevent the drum surface getting too hot. You might have to roast really slow. You might have to keep the batch size modest because they're so prone to getting little burn marks all over the beans if they're exposed to hot metal.
Yeah. So you're saying a lot of times it seems like you're saying that like burn marks, tipping, scorching are the main indicators of like an overfilled drum for traditional
I
drum
think
roasters.
if you take like a high grown washed bean, like I don't think you have to worry about overfilling and burning, but I think the softer beans kind of tell you more obviously when you've damaged them, right? And
Right.
I think with the other beans, you might be able to taste a little bit of damage, but you almost never see it because they're a little bit tougher on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you already kind of mentioned this going from the overfilled to the underfilled, or like, I guess, overfilled to like small batch. Are there any tips or tricks that you can use to replicate roasting a like super small batch? Do you use like ambient temperature, inlet temperature, or do you just like
Oh,
cross your fingers and send it?
so I guess you're talking about if the batch is so small that the bean probe's okay. So I did this once a long time ago. Like I didn't have a sample roaster handy. It was about 20 years ago, and someone gave me the 20 lots from the Best of Panama auction that year, and I was like, thank you. I don't know what I'm going to roast these in, and I only had a 22 kilo roaster, and so what I decided to do was I treated it. So Mike Sivitz had this thing he called Sivitz mode, and his advice, right or wrong, with air roasters was to basically set the inlet temperature to a constant and never change it. And surprisingly, that works strangely well. It may not be optimal, but it's a hell of an easy way to get like a decent result in an air roaster. So I kind of took that mentality and I set my drum roaster. I idled it at one temperature. I think it was 420 Fahrenheit for a long time. And then what I did was I just put the beans in. They were 100 grams each. I put them in one by one. I waited till I heard like a pop, listening with the trier out because I couldn't, hear them. And then I dropped the batches and I would just do the next one, do the next one. So I had this constant, never changing air temperature, and it wasn't perfect, but I was surprised it actually like it was passable. It was decent. So I think a relatively stable, controlled air temperature is probably the only way to do it, because I don't even know how you would craft like an inlet temperature curve or a gas setting curve if you don't have any feedback from the beans. But I just guessed. I was like, well, if I'm going to drop these at 405 and I set the air to 400, they probably won't really stall till after first crack, so I'm probably safe, and it kind of worked. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you have other experiments like that, or any other tips for like a roaster who wants to find the ideal batch, like practical
Right.
experiments that they
So
can run?
I guess I'm not of the mindset that there's like a perfect ideal batch size. There might be for some machines, but I think there's a pretty good range where most of us would say you could succeed pretty well. But I think that the really hard part, if you want to do really small batches in a drum roaster, I think the hard part is figuring out how to have a between batch protocol that supports this. So for instance, if you might have a between batch protocol for say 10 kilo batches in a 12 kilo machine, that's going to start with a relatively hot machine every batch, and that would be much too hot for a tiny batch. So let's say you were going to do 2 kilo batches because you had some competition you were entering and you wanted to roast tiny amounts of the coffee. I think the hardest part is finding what's the reasonable between batch protocol to reset the thermal energy of that machine to the same low level every time. That's actually shockingly hard to do, I think. But I think that's really, if you can figure that out, I think everything else gets pretty easy after that.
Yeah, cool. I want to talk about consistency, because I recall that you talked about this in the master class, that in order to have a consistent result, you need to have consistent batch sizes for the coffee. Is there any way that you have seen or found to maintain consistency and change batch sizes, whether that's like changing the end temperature, adjusting development time?
Right. So I think it's certainly possible to do different batch sizes and be consistent. It's just harder, of course. I mean, if someone says to you, come up with a system, do 10 kilograms every batch for the rest of your life, after a little while, you'd be set forever, right? But if someone says, okay, do it at 10 and then do it at 6 and then do it at 4 and then go to 8, like that's hard. And so the best thing I've come up with, and it's not perfect, but it's decent, is what I call a transitional BBP, between batch protocol, where maybe you're in a drum roaster and maybe your typical BBP is you turn off the gas for roughly 4 minutes and you're bottoming at, say, a beat temperature of, say, 360, and then you're running the gas for a minute and you get up to 400 and you charge, right? And maybe that's your BBP for your 9 kilo batch. And then someone says, okay, I need 5 kilo batches, right? Then you would have a slightly cooler BBP in terms of bottoming temperature and charge temperature for the 5s. But then how do you get from the last 9 to the first 5? And so there's a thing I call the transitional BBP, which usually the first time I try it on a machine, I'll do something like I will turn off the gas for 8 minutes. Then I will turn on the gas about twice as high as I would usually turn it on the way up during a BBP. And I would charge at the 5 kilos intended charge temperature. And likewise, when you're going, say, from 5 to 9, I would actually go above the charge temperature for something like about 8 minutes and then kind of revert to something closer to normal BBP after that. Those will get you in the ballpark of, I think, being able to figure out the answer, but it probably won't work the first time you try it. I will say that sometimes I'll use the BBP as a test. So in other words, let's say you challenge me to go from 5 to 9, and I'm not really sure if I reset the thermal energy properly for the 9 kilo batch. I might try the BBP before charging the normal BBP before charging the 9. And if the temperature drops too fast or rises too fast or drops too slow or rises too slow, it kind of tells me if the machine is a little hotter or a little cooler than it would normally be at the end of that 9 kilo BBP that we'd usually use. So it's both a method to reset thermal energy. It also can be used kind of as a test. And a few times when I was playing with a machine I was unfamiliar with recently, I did that a few times and said, okay, I missed. It's definitely too cool. I need to do something to get it warmer before charging that first 9 kilo batch. And that was not a perfect, but a decent test to help.
Sure. So that's talking about the like initial thermal energy that you're going into a batch. Do you ever change the like end temperature? Like if it's a smaller batch size, having the end temperature be a couple degrees up or down, or
Right.
Does that totally depend? Or
Right. So I'm going to assume, let's say you have your 9 kilo and your 5 kilo batch again. I'm going to assume you want the same color at the end, right? I think that the main reason why the bean temperature reading might not be the same at that color at the end of the 5 kilo and 9 kilo batch is the air temperature in the 9 kilo batch at the end of the roast is probably a lot higher than the 5 kilo batch. And the bean probe reading is not a perfect reading of bean surface temperature. It's somewhat influenced. Like in my brain, it's about 80% surface temperature and about 20% air temperature. That might be a little bit off. But so if maybe your air temperature surrounding the beans at the end of the 9 kilo batch is 420 and the air surrounding the beans in the 5 kilo batches is say 400, it might actually change the bean temperature reading by like perhaps 4 degrees in either direction. So I think we are probably shooting for the same bean temperature and bean color at the end of every batch, no matter the batch size, but the different air temperatures are what's making the bean temperature reading look a little different.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Yeah. In addition to your own writing, do you know any other resources where roasters can learn about batch sizes? I had a very hard time finding anything.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I've read pretty much every scientific paper that's ever come out about coffee roasting, no one really talks much about batch sizes. It's not really their concern. I don't think Rob wrote much about batch sizes in his book. I don't remember, but I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not I think it's one of those practical topics that isn't explored much, and let's face it, if you've got a Loring and somebody else has a Probat, like they're not thinking about it the same. So there's not like a ultimate thing you can say about batch size that's kind of simple and clean and applies to everyone. So it's probably not a popular topic in that sense,
Right. It's not there. It's so different and so diverse that there's not a one common rule that
Sure.
can be
Sure.
spread as gospel.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything that's the end of my my questions?
Okay. Cool.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about batch sizes that we didn't cover?
Sure. I think this is a very small thing, but we've kind of touched upon this a bit before, but I've had a lot of clients who moved from, say, a drum roaster to an air roaster, and sometimes it's hard to change your mindset between two different machines, right? And I think that most of the limitations that we think about in roasting, like, oh, you shouldn't roast faster than 8 minutes, or you shouldn't go over 80% capacity or something like that. Most of those are artifacts of drum roasting being dominant. And I think now that air roasting, with the advent of the Loring, especially, air roasting is becoming more and more popular, and ideally will become a lot more popular. I think a lot of those boundaries that people put on things like batch sizes and temperatures and times and stuff like that are not going to be true for air roasters. There's, I think, a lot more flexibility in air roasters. So I think people hopefully will keep that in mind. And if you do keep that in mind, I think it's easier to switch between machines without carrying too much baggage, in a sense, from a previous machine. Yeah,
For sure. Maybe I should write 2 articles, one for drum roasters and one for air roasters.
totally right.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, your wealth of knowledge is very helpful. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kat. Nice chatting with you.
Thanks for that info, Scott, and thank you for watching. If you have other questions about batch size, put them in the comments below, and make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll catch more roasting content. Next week's video will be the 3rd in this batch size series. It's an interview with Cameron Heath at Counterculture Coffee. If you missed the first video, I'll put the link in the description below. That interview with Shelby Williamson of Huckleberry Roasters is one of my favorites, full of practical information, especially useful for production roasters. And get the September-October issue of Roast Magazine to read the full article, which consolidates all the information from these interviews and more research that I did. Thanks for watching. Cheers.